I'm Jim Check. You're watching Kelowna Now. With me, Mario Canseco. Busy time of the year. Pollster with Research Co. What's in the magic ball? Like, what are you seeing?
Well, a remarkable change, especially when you compare it to the last survey we conducted in early January of this year, right before Justin Trudeau stepped down. At the time, the Conservatives were getting 47% of support among decided voters across the country, majorities in Ontario and in British Columbia. And now, just after this election gets called, they're 4 points behind the Liberals, statistical ties in Ontario and Atlantic Canada and in BC, and an election that is definitely developing into a two-party race. The NDP is in single digits across the country and in British Columbia. They haven't had numbers this low since Alexa McDonough back in 2000. The Bloc also dropping its level of support, and the Greens and the People's Party would not qualify for the debate unless they do something radical in the next couple of weeks. So, there's all this talk about Canada becoming the 51st state and whatnot. At least when it comes to politics, it's certainly turning like an American election. You have a blue option and a red option, and everything else is just significantly lower.
Yeah, even Tom McClare, a former NDP leader, has come out and said, like, "Hey, everybody else, take a seat and let the Liberals and the Conservatives fight this out." Because I half-ass agree with him that we need a clear mandate, whatever we get, because this minority government stuff really hasn't served Canada well for the past two terms.
Well, and we're seeing that happen already, even before Tom Mulcair talked about it, where the retention rate for the NDP at this stage, when you compare how many voters they had in 2021 to the ones that are saying that they're going to stay with the party this time, is 58%. So you're losing 42% of your voters, most of them to the Liberals, some of them to the Conservatives. But it's not a great situation, particularly for long-serving incumbents. When you're that low, it means that specific shifts in places such as Vancouver or New Westminster or Burnaby could actually end up with some of those incumbents losing their seats. The one who's in the most precarious situation is Jagmeet Singh, because that wasn't a safe seat to begin with. It was won by Kennedy Stewart back in 2015 by less than a couple of points. So if the shift that we're seeing at the BC-wide level, as far as the vote going from orange to red, happens at the same rate in some of these ridings, they may only save one or two seats in the entire province.
Yeah, you and I talked about this. We've talked a couple times, and you and I talked about how Justin Trudeau and the smell that was on him really would have rubbed off on Jagmeet, because he kind of held him in there for a long time, and I think that's really starting to show. I think a lot of people that were angry at Justin Trudeau, now they just have one person to focus that on, and that's Jagmeet Singh.
Well, it's a definite problem for them, because for a long time, we saw the numbers for Jagmeet Singh very similar to what we saw for Jack Layton in his first two elections. He was very personable. His approval ratings were higher. He was the guy you wanted to hang out with, not necessarily vote for the NDP. But he had that favorability factor in the first couple of elections that he fought. Now, because of everything that's happened after the agreement that the NDP had with the Liberals, the numbers haven't really changed that much. And to me, it's remarkable that his numbers, as far as favorability from January to March, are stagnant. It's 38, 39%. You're not really climbing the charts. You're not reconnecting with that base that really liked you before. And I think it has a lot to do with the expectations of Canadians for what was supposed to happen with this agreement. We had very grandiose ideas about what pharmacare was going to bring, or the quickness in which the dental care program was going to be implemented. So now we look back on it and go, maybe this wasn't the best course of action. I can't be mad at Justin Trudeau, but I can certainly be mad at Jagmeet Singh.
And where do you think that the Liberals picked up? I see they're picking up a lot of support out of the NDP, but Poilievre is losing some support as well. And where do you think he misstepped? Do you think it's the fear that's being driven by the Liberals? That actually worked out well for the Liberals by ramping up the fear with Trump. It's actually worked out to their benefit. Do you think that's all of it, though?
That is a significant portion of it, because what we see is the over 55 voter that was very reliably conservative in the Stephen Harper victories is now looking at the Liberals as the option they would support. So, and they're more likely to say that the number one issue facing the country is Canada-US relations. The key for the Conservatives to bring this back into a statistical tie at the national level, or even be a couple of points ahead of the Liberals, is to reconnect with middle-aged and younger voters. Your voter aged 18 to 34 isn't completely captivated by the Trump situation. They're worried about the economy and jobs and housing. And I think that's one of the reasons behind the last couple of days being very focused on housing. Essentially Pierre Poilievre talking about tax breaks. He is really desperate to tap into this demographic that 2 months ago was solidly behind him and now is having second thoughts. It certainly helps the liberals because if this becomes a referendum on who you want to manage Donald Trump, there's an edge for Mark Carney. He's also seen as a better prime minister, even though he's been on the job for less than a month. So the danger for the liberals is, are you peaking too early? Are you in a situation where people like what they believe Mark Carney is? And once they get to know who Mark Carney actually is and the specific policies that he's discussing, could the numbers drop a little bit? Because we're used to having this fluctuation from the center-left party that is not going to form the government, whether it's the Greens or the NDP, to the liberals in the final stages of the campaign. We weren't expecting this situation to happen on day 2 of the campaign.
Yeah, I think the big cow pie for the Liberals is the Brookfield Asset Management, and I think Jagmeet Singh finally realizes that his real adversary is the Liberals, and is starting to drag out quite a bit of stuff on Brookfield Asset Management, and Carney is very reluctant to talk about that or disclose that. That might be his Achilles heel too, just his lack of wanting to be transparent with it, and then actually, I watched Trump, and he's very demeaning towards reporters and stuff when they ask questions. And Carney has a way of being actually just as bad, just in a more arrogant way. Like, he actually calls out reporters, and he's done it with CBC and Globe and Mail, and calls them out by name and says, "Well, you should know better," and basically makes them ashamed of asking a question. And I think that arrogance might not play well either.
Well, I think it's part of the growing pains of the job. He's never run for elected office. It's hard enough to knock on doors in your constituency and get to know people who you're going to be representing. But doing this when you're traveling to probably 2 or 3 places every day and answering the same questions, there's people who grow into the job and love it, and there's others who don't enjoy it that much. So part of this is going to be, how can you establish that emotional connection with voters if most of your interactions with the press are not particularly great? It's part of the complexity that the Liberal team will have to deal with. Because, if we go back to the 2015 election, the early stages of the campaign, Tom Mulcair and Stephen Harper were the ones that were seeming to be a little more careful, few questions their way. And it was Justin Trudeau who was standing there for an hour and a half listening to anything that any reporter would say to him. So there's a way to establish that emotional connection if you know how to deal with the press.
Yeah, I think, and I've watched a lot of it, that Mark Carney has a tough time. Like, he hasn't been a politician, has a tough time relating to, he didn't know the price of groceries. He has a tough time relating to the average Canadian. And, if he doesn't ramp that up, and then making missteps, or, like some people, as the CBC would put it, couched truths, or whatever you want to call them, right? Half-truths.
Alternative facts, as they call them in the States.
Yeah. And then, and Poilievre obviously a little more polished. And the question in the polls, though, it's been a dramatic swing, not even a small swing, and we see this even in the poly markets and a bunch of polls that come out. Yeah. But the crowd seemed to be still really big for Poilievre versus what Carney's getting out. How do you kind of reconcile that?
Well, I think it depends on the organization more than anything. We've seen other parties that end up losing elections that have significant crowds in specific places. This really comes down to the organizational level at the ridings. And there's places where you might get a significantly higher level of support, but the riding doesn't organize enough to get more than 50 people in a room for you. That is part of the complexity of the way this campaign goes. Obviously, you want to have that opportunity to have significant crowds behind you, but we saw it in the United States. We saw those latter stages in which the rallies for Kamala Harris in places like Pennsylvania or Wisconsin were significantly larger than what Donald Trump was getting. But Trump ended up winning those states handily.
But I guess I would couch that by saying, a CBC term, couch that by saying Kamala Harris brought out, big name stars that kind of attracted people. Like Beyonce is going to be singing, and then Beyonce doesn't sing, and it kind of fell flat a little bit. And you and I talked about the U.S. election. We said Pennsylvania was the key there, and turns out to be you were right there. Pennsylvania definitely the key. And then where do you see the key here being in this election? Is it typically just like some Ontario ridings, Quebec, what the Bloc does, or what do you think the the big kind of like what they have to move to kind of shift it either way?
I think there's a couple of areas that are crucial. I mean, obviously, Ontario has the most seats. The complexity here is the drop in the level of support for the NDP could allow the Liberals to recapture some of the ridings that they lost before. And this doesn't bode well as the map continues to move to the west. The other issue that is fascinating to watch is what's happening with the Bloc in Quebec, because we went from a situation where your hardcore sovereignist voter was saying, here comes the Pierre Poilievre government. So what we need is to send a significant number of Bloc Québécois MPs to be the opposition, because the Liberals are so decimated that we might actually become the official opposition the same way we were back in 1993. In January, we had the Bloc at 37%. In March, we have them at 22. So
Mhm.
you've lost essentially a third of the level of support that you had. And these are hardcore sovereignist voters who are saying to themselves, we might be better off voting Liberal this time and then pursuing sovereignty during the Mark Carney tenure. Now, with everything that's happening with Donald Trump and the tariffs, might not be the right time to try to do something like this. So it's quite ironic that the one thing that might save the Liberals and could actually propel them to a majority government is the fact that the sovereignist voter is having second thoughts because of one Donald Trump.
Yeah, and then also the Conservatives really kind of had a lock on the Atlantic provinces too, and that seems to have slipped away. But I guess the one question there is a couple of, well, several Liberal MPs resigned and said they're going to be with their family. Now they all seem to be coming back. Sean Fraser yesterday said, at first he said family comes first, and then I guess yesterday Liberals come first, right? But Anita Anand is another one of those, and then they kind of elbows up. They kind of elbowed that guy out. I think it was Graham something, Lee or something, like that. Graham something, that got hopefully he didn't pay too much for his signs, but yeah. So I guess they all see that resurgence, and it's going to be an interesting race for sure. And then the one point that you made there too is on the older people, the tax cut for Poilievre. Obviously, he's trying to connect with the older people and see if he can buy some of them back into the fold, because if I would have been bolder if I was running, I would have said no tax for seniors, because they paid for their whole lives, right? You and I are getting close, right? So
Yes. Well, it's an interesting dilemma when you're looking at the way in which the campaign has been organized, because you go through a very contested nomination process for the Conservatives in most of the ridings. People said, I see Poilievre forming the government. I want to be part of this. This is the moment where I'm throwing my hat into the ring. And now you have that happening for Liberal nomination processes. They couldn't find enough people to run in specific places. And now you have very open races and a lot of people, former councillors. We have the former mayor of Vancouver running here in a new riding that encompasses part of Vancouver, part of Burnaby. Now you have a situation where people are lining up to run for the Liberals. That being said, I think the nomination process of the Conservatives in BC was not stellar. You had people of the caliber of Anita Huberman in Surrey and Mike DeYoung in Abbotsford South Langley, who essentially were told not to be participants. And these are people with significant experience who would have done a great job trying to sell what Pierre Poilievre is trying to sell to BC residents. And they were summarily asked to step aside.
I saw something out there, Danielle Smith, very outspoken, very outspoken for Alberta. And then somebody was saying that Danielle Smith needs to be quiet. She's not helping with Pierre Poilievre. I'm not sure.
Well, you look at the numbers, it's not as if she's going to deliver Alberta for the Conservatives. It's a place where, the Liberals, the NDP might get one or two or three
Yeah,
seats, depending on how the situation unfolds. But I think part of it has been the success that somebody like Doug Ford had. He wasn't betraying his conservative principles or doing something that was going to go against the base of support that he had. But he did decide to stand tall and to actually call an election based on something that was happening outside of his borders, and he ended up winning. It wasn't as massive a mandate as what people expected, but this is still historic. You win 3 majority mandates in a row in the most populous province. I think that is part of the danger here. Can you sustain something where you say, I am a conservative, these are my values? I think this is going to be helpful to us, but ultimately also taking the Team Canada approach.
Yeah, he hasn't come out in favor of either party yet, but that remains to be seen where that is. When do you do your next poll?
We're hoping to do something in the next couple of weeks. I want to take a look at the Trump tariffs. We did a survey right before he decided that he wasn't going to implement them. And what was interesting to us is we started to see a level of animosity about this that was extremely high. You have pretty much 90% of Canadians paying attention to the story. And to me, this suggests that even your most cynical voter, the one that says that they're all crooks and they're all terrible, and why am I wasting my time? That voter is paying attention to this campaign. That voter is worried about the effect of Donald
Mhm.
Trump in their jobs, in their livelihoods, and the livelihoods of their families. So we could have a larger voter turnout than we had back in 2019 and 2021. We haven't had 3 out of 4 eligible voters cast a ballot since the 1980s. So maybe this will be the year.
The NDP and the Liberals, both of them seem to do really well when fear is amped up, and they tend to kind of like push that, and that's kind of like their magic. That's their magic weapon, I guess, and then they use it well. And I guess like it's a tough one because and I guess Polyev has been kind of like hard on Trump as well, but it's a tough one for him to beat because that has been their secret sauce for sure.
Well, the thing is, how long is this going to last? And I remember the first week of the 2021 campaign, you had the feeling that Erin O'Toole was going to pull through. And the reason was the fall of Afghanistan. You have a former soldier who's discussing foreign policy at a level that was infinitely superior to what Andrew Scheer had done a couple of years earlier. And you started to see that trend. If the election had happened that week, we would have Erin O'Toole as our head of government. But you still have 4 weeks to go. And it's ultimately about how you reject this message. One thing that is really striking is the level of undecideds is pretty low right now. It's about 10%. Usually it's about 14 or 15 at this stage of the campaign. So how many of these votes are ultimately not going to move when the campaign is underway? But anything can happen. And I think, it's very different from what we saw back in January. But if it changed so rapidly, we could be in for a lot of fluctuation from here until the end of the month.
Do you ever look at poly markets?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always
Yeah.
curious about numbers.
Yeah, it's an interesting one to look at, right? Because they're pretty close in the U.S. election stuff, right? So, and right now they definitely are, they're kind of aligning with what, some of the polls. Well, obviously, some of the polls are very biased, and you kind of take them with a grain of salt. But yeah, the question I have though is will Canadians ask? Because it seems like Mark Carney is putting in the same team. There's not a lot of different players. Like he's even recruiting some of the people that were leaving this team. So how is it that people are expecting a different result from what they had? And it seems to be a similar agenda too. Like we seem to be like he couches the climate stuff versus like the pipeline stuff. Even the Bloc has come out and said like no pipelines in Quebec. So it's pretty hard to build an east-west pipeline without Quebec, right? So. And then, like even if you go read his platform, there's like climate change is still like one of the number one drivers for his policies.
Quebec is an interesting case because you do have a larger level of voter participation from the youth. And it's become the most environmentally friendly province, if we were to use that term. That used to be British Columbia, but now the situation has changed drastically. And it's a difficult situation when you're trying to campaign as a pro Canada leader who needs to discuss the environment in Quebec. And you end up in a situation where you say one thing in French when you're in Montreal and a very different one in English when you're in Edmonton. This is the kind of campaign that they're going to have to run. And it's really difficult to really wrap your head around it because of the way in which campaigns are now happening, the emphasis on social media, the fact that if you say something wrong, it's going to be repeated on YouTube for the next 3 or 4 days. So it's certainly a more scripted campaign than it has been in recent years.
I have to say, I think this is the third time we've had you on. I believe. I think this is the third time.
Yeah.
You've been bang on Pennsylvania, bang on a spring election, right? Because you called the spring election. You said we're going to have a spring election, and sure enough, we got a spring election. Do you want to make any predictions, or is it too close right now to really say where it's going to go?
It's so complicated. I think part of this is what happens with the minor parties. If we continue to see this momentum where your former Green voter, your former NDP voter says we're sticking with the Liberals because we fear a Polyev government, it
Yeah.
could be very similar to what we saw in 2015. But I think there's an opportunity for the Conservatives to say, Yes, we talked about a carbon tax. The campaign is no longer about this. We wanted Trudeau to get out. Now he's out. Look at us in a different light. And this is the type of policy that we're going to be putting forward. So I think we're still in the early stages, and there might be a lot of movement from one side to the other. But I think might be a particularly destructive election for the NDP. If they finish in single digits, there's a significant possibility that that's the case. There's going to be a serious discussion about the future of this party and whether or not it would be best to either merge with the Liberals or do something that is very different from what is happening right now, because it's been a steady drop in the level of support since Jack Layton passed away.
Yeah, so it's like they've almost been merged the whole time anyway, right? But you brought up the carbon tax, and instead of Pierre Poilievre doing a victory lap on that, because he basically killed the carbon tax in Canada, but the Liberals actually front run him and said that they're the ones that decided that it's no longer this is because of divisive politics, and they're the ones taking the victory lap on the carbon tax. It's just they actually took that right away from him.
Well, and this is part of what makes this a very compelling election. You know, the brochures that I got from the Conservative candidate in my riding of Vancouver Quadra are very different this week than they were a month ago. A month ago, it was all about getting rid of the carbon tax. 2 months ago, it was about Justin Trudeau's bad. So I'm sure Conservative candidates have a bunch of leaflets that they printed out and they can't give us anymore because the campaign is fundamentally different.
No GST on homes.
No, exactly. Well, and this is also part of why the housing file is so crucial. You know, the Liberals are a fundamentally urban party. They might get more seats, but a lot of those seats are in Toronto, are in Vancouver. That is the area where you need to target people. And this is what they said. We understand that if you live in Vancouver, $1 million isn't enough for you to buy a home. We're going to kick it up to 1.3. Otherwise, you're not going to qualify.
Yeah, Jagmeet Singh, Holly Doan from Blacklocks, I'm sure you know her, came out with a story today. Jagmeet Singh accusing BAM, Brookfield Asset Management, of taking advantage of renters. And there's, like I think Carney's words in that document was like our sweet spot where we can squeeze the renter. So I don't know, like again, not sure where that one's going to shake out, but housing definitely a big thing for most Canadians. Housing. And, we actually interviewed him here and we were at the rally there and asked the question. And Carney, a misstep here too, when he said that opioid crisis, a crisis in the States, but maybe just challenging here. And that didn't go very well either.
I remember that, yes. Well, yeah. It's always that soundbite, right? I mean, people expect the debates to have that knockout punch. We're going to have a significantly better moderator this time. So I think that'll help all of the candidates. But will there be a knockout punch in the debate? Will it be a soundbite? Will it be a moment that gets people to think about the election differently? Events on the ground always change these things.
Yeah, and I've watched a bunch of things on public speakers. And, one of the things about Justin Trudeau, he's a good speaker. He's charismatic, and he was a good speaker. As is, Donald Trump is a good speaker. I may not like what he says, but he's a good speaker. And then Pierre Poilievre, very polished speaker. And Mark Carney, like you can count the ums and ahs in there, like in a couple sentences, you can rack them up. And that's usually a tough thing. And a lot of Kamala Harris kind of spin down the drain kind of thing when he answers questions, especially financial questions when he's trying to be evasive. When he starts saying, first off, let me tell you the first thing. And then he never gets to the second thing, right?
That's the thing, there's similarities. If you're a conservative, you take solace in the 93 election because people really liked the idea of Kim Campbell. And when the campaign began and they saw Kim Campbell, the numbers started to shift. And, they did a terrible job with that ad that mocked Chrétien's face. And we all know how that ended up for the progressive conservatives who only won 2 seats. But I think that is part of the essence of this. Are we going to have a situation where Canadians pay more attention to Mark Carney and start to have second thoughts? Or is it going to go the other way around?
Yeah, I think that their secret weapon is definitely Trump, and Trump seems to give them lots of ammo. And I think even today when Chrystia Freeland came out there with that attack on Tesla, that was to see if they can get a reaction, I think, and see if they, because those reactions are actually like gold for them right now.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a rare campaign because we know that everything can change with a tweet. April 2nd is when the tariffs are supposed to be coming in. So that is going to dominate that week of the campaign. there's still a long way to go. I wouldn't be surprised if the numbers dance even more.
I think you nailed it there when you said everything can change with a tweet, because X has become so important. Even though lots of politicians and that will say they refuse to use it and all this stuff, but we've seen world leaders from all countries in the world announce their stuff, and even Kamala Harris, when she conceded, it was on X. It wasn't through a press conference or anything. It was just on X, right? So X is really kind of like where politics and financial stuff really is. They're kind of like the playground for X.
It's the Buckley's of world politics. It tastes awful, but it works.
There you go. Anything else you want to add before I've kept you long enough?
Oh,
Anything else
it's
you
my
want to
pleasure
share?
to be here. Let's see where we go. I think the NDP to liberal fluctuation was expected. The bloc fluctuation to liberal, not as much. And there's an opportunity for the leaders to reconnect. I don't think we have an emotional connection at this stage. It's basically, who do you want to deal with Trump? But it hasn't been completely galvanized in the minds of the electorate. So we'll have to wait and see.
Well, we'll have you on a couple more times before we get the final results. And we always, as always, we appreciate your time. Thank you, Mary Canseco. And we do thank you for watching Kelowna Now.
Thank you, Jim.
We don't just report the news. We live here too. We're your neighbors, bringing you stories that matter to all of us. No government funding, no outside influence. Kelowna Now, local, independent. News you can trust.